Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of This Week in San Diego Soccer History. I'm John Cross, along with Dylan Wilson. And Dylan, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing all right, surviving the heat this past weekend. Actually had the day off, took the day off work, so been a nice kind of chillaxed day.
Good. Yeah, it's nice that the weather is cooling off a little bit here this week and should be beautiful this weekend. Um, I know we have talked repeatedly about our thoughts and feelings about the World Cup, and the World Cup now has finally started. It is underway. Been watching any games, or how do you feel now that the tournament has actually started?
I have been watching some games, but I've found a way to do so and feel a little bit better about it. I've actually been watching the
Oh
Telemundo
yeah.
broadcasts. Yes.
Oh yes.
And that actually started not out of any intention. I just this is a whole tangent I'm going to try not to go down here, but it feels like a lot of the apps I would use to stream whether shows or games don't do casting anymore and opt instead for like the Apple AirPlay screen mirroring thing, which
Right.
I have long felt is a lot worse just in terms of its functionality. So out of the frustration of finding that the Fox Sports app no longer supports casting to my television, I have Peacock just built into the TV. So I flipped over to the Telemundo broadcast and I realized I don't have to listen to Alexi Lawless talk. I don't speak much Spanish, but you can kind of get the gist of it, right?
Oh yeah.
And the announcers are just like way more into it. The vibes are better, even if I'm not understanding all of what they're saying. So I've found that pretty entertaining. Picking up little bits, pieces here and there. But yeah, overall, it's been fun. It's been an exciting tournament thus far. Some good games. I think yesterday was the second time in World Cup history where there were at least 4 games and they all resulted in draws.
It resulted in
But
draws. Yeah.
yeah, but it's still exciting games, I thought. So, and I know, some local folks have been getting up to games in LA, especially, but I think all over the West Coast too.
Yeah. I know there's quite a few people that we both know that have been able to make it out to games, and it seems like crowds have been good. Like you said, games have been exciting. I still have my mixed feelings, but I've been watching my fair share, but certainly not as much as I had done in the past. I feel like I come in the last 20 minutes of most games, um, other than the U.S. of course playing, because still watch the full game there. But I've been coming in for a lot of the end, and like you, I've been kind of splitting my viewing between Fox and Telemundo. But one of the things I enjoy most about a lot of the Spanish language broadcasters is the level of excitement and the tone. Like, whether you understand the language or not, you can tell when a play is building, when things are getting exciting. And one of my most frustrating things with American broadcasters, especially ones who have grown up with other sports and then try to cover soccer, is they get into what I call baseball mode, where they'll start having conversations about players and other color kind of commentary where they feel like they need to fill in the gaps, and then they want to finish a story as a play is developing and building, and then they just kind of jump in at the last minute, and that always frustrates me. So I will frequently watch our more American broadcasters if I watch it all with the volume off, if I don't switch over to something like Telemundo. But I agree with you, the Telemundo coverage is awesome.
They're also on
Great place to watch
Telemundo,
the World Cup.
as I'm sure you've noticed. They don't cut away to commercials
Yes.
during the hydration
during
breaks,
the
which, like,
during our commercial break.
right, and I mean they do the banner thing or whatever, but the commentators still have the live mics. They're still showing the
Right.
players in the stadium and the fans, and it makes a bigger difference than you might guess, because you can still get up, go to the bathroom, do whatever you need to do, and not miss anything. But you're also not inundated with like Michelob Ultra commercials. So hopefully
Right.
we don't
Yeah.
get DMCA'd for me mentioning that. But
Yeah. Right. Um, well, I mean, obviously the World Cup is going right now, and we ended up missing last week episode, which we bumped to this week because for a variety of reasons we couldn't get that show off the air or get it going last week. But it does revolve around the World Cup, specifically the 1990 World Cup, and SDSU's connection to that, and that was our trivia question that we had that we left at the end of our last episode we recorded. So let me go ahead and pull that up on the screen. Our trivia question was, what were the trivia question was 3 SDSU Aztecs were part of the 1990 World Cup roster. How many of them can you name? So, Dylan, we've had a little bit of time since our last episode and with the World Cup starting, and there certainly is a lot of conversation about prior U.S. World Cup teams. Do you have any of the players from that were connected to SDSU that made that 1990 World Cup squad?
I didn't. Looking at the answers now, I should have gotten one of them because I did know Mr. Eric Wynalda was an SDSU Aztec, but I that escaped me when thinking about it.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and we'll pull the answer up here on the bottom of the screen. The 3 players with SDSU connections for the 1990 World Cup were Marcelo Balboa, Chris Sullivan, and of course, as you said, Eric Wynalda. There were, well, we'll get into it in a second, but there were quite a few players from California that made that team representing various colleges. But we'll get into that when we get into our main story. We usually do a birthday section right now, and since this episode was supposed to be last week, I didn't really look ahead to the birthdays for this particular week, because last week we were supposed to do this on June 9th, which happened to be Eric Wynalda's birthday, so we're just going to do a shout out for that. That was why we had set this episode to go for last week. So Eric Wynalda's birthday, a belated happy birthday to Eric Wynalda. And then for news and current events, there's been a few things that have happened with some San Diego ties since we last had an episode. One is, Dylan, do you ever watch the TST, the Total Soccer Tournament that they do, here in the spring, the 7-on-7?
I watched a lot of it last year. It totally missed my radar this year though. But
yeah,
it is entertaining. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
It missed my radar quite a bit as well. I think besides other obvious soccer stuff happening, I had other stuff going on, and I loosely knew about it, but I didn't really tune into the games like I had done before. And in fact, it was pointed out to me for the final because I didn't see the final or anything. But we had a longtime former San Diego Sockers player was the person who scored the $1 million goal in the TST men's finals. That would be Brandon Escoto. And as people, I hope, know by now with TST, it's a 7-on-7 tournament. They play 2 20-minute halves, but the game must end on a goal. That's kind of their unique thing. So whatever the score is at the end of the second half, whoever's winning, you add 1 to their score, and that becomes their target score. So if it scores 4-2, then 5 is the target, and the first team to 5 then wins. So it still gives the team that's losing a chance at the end, but everyone knows what the target score that they're playing for is, and then the game ends on a goal, obviously, so it's 1-5 in the case I gave. But there are also interesting rules are if you go to extra time, or when you get into extra time, in that target score time, every 3 minutes they pull a player off each team. So you start 7v7, 3 minutes later, if there's no score, it's 6v6, then 5v5, and so forth. All the way down, if no one scores, to 2v2 on their same 7v7 field. So a lot of running, very tiring, but usually you get a goal fairly soon after you get to 2v2, if you even make it that far. And in the final match of in regulation, Hernandez United, they're from Virginia. That was the team that Brandon Escoto was playing for. They were ahead 2-1 to Pumas de Alabama. And so target score obviously is 3. No one scores in the extra time until the teams all the way get down to 2v2. At 2v2, Pumas ties the match at 2v2. So again, whoever scores next wins, and Brandon Escoto got the $1 million target goal. I don't know how far into it, time-wise, it actually was, but they had to play a decent amount of time in the extra time. And they were already at 2v2 when Pumas scored. But there were a lot of near misses and good saves by goalkeepers when they were down to 2v2. but he finally got it, scored the $1 million goal. So big shout out to Brandon Escoto, the longtime San Diego Sockers player. And then a couple of notes on some former Loyal players. I don't know if you heard, Dylan. Did you hear Colin Martin announced his retirement?
I did, yes. It's too bad, but I hope whatever he goes on to next, I'm sure he'll be successful. He was one of my favorite players to watch during the Loyal years.
Yeah, agreed. He, I think it was earlier this month in June. He's 31, I believe. He was playing for North Carolina, and anybody who follows USL should know and probably remembers how North Carolina folded their men's team at the end of the playoffs, and announced right before the playoffs started that they'd be folding their men's team. But he was actually out with an ACL injury. He has recovered, but I think with the injury and age and everything else, sounds like he decided to pull the trigger on retirement. So like you, wish him the best of luck in whatever he does in the future, and which means for us, maybe, I don't know, soon-ish, because we have a lot of things scheduled on our calendar for shows coming up, but I'm sure at some point we'll be doing a retrospective on Colin Martin's career, since he had a significant impact here in San Diego and was certainly, if you followed the one of the best, or one of the most liked players that were part of the San Diego Loyal.
I don't think it's
And
a
then,
stretch to say he was one of the most technically gifted as well. I mean, the dude was
oh
so good on
yes,
the ball, and his long passing was, at least for USL standards, Pirlo-esque. So always enjoyed watching him play.
yeah, I agree. Definitely, you know, at the USL Championship level, stood out very well as a stronger player. But keeping along with somewhat of San Diego Loyal news, certainly a connection. Did you hear that Josh Yarrow got loaned out to AC Boise, which is
I did.
slowly becoming San Diego Loyal Part 2?
Well, no, I was really glad to see that. I haven't really tuned into as many Boise games as I would have liked this year, but it is kind of fun that they're getting the gang back together, and I'm sure as soon as it was made known that Josh Yarrow could, potentially be available for a loan, that Nate Miller was on the phone doing so,
Oh
because
yeah,
our defense never looked as good as when Josh Yarrow was there that one year. So yeah, I'm excited for him. It's too bad he's never really been able to establish himself at St. Louis. I know he's gotten minutes here and there, but I think at this point in his career, he'd probably rather just be playing. So I'm sure he'll go and do very well there.
yeah. He's like a lot of players, I think, fall into this, where definitely strong player at the USL Championship level. Yeah, like too good for USL Championship. You think he ought to be able to go up, but then at the MLS level seems to just not quite be good enough. Kind of just in that in between range. And I don't know, maybe with another team he might have seen more minutes in Major League Soccer, but just kind of right on the cusp. And I agree. I wish he would have had more opportunities at a higher level. Great person and great player. All right. Let's see, making sure I'm not missing anything. Before we get to our main topic, we do have another trivia question. And this trivia question is going to sound almost identical to the one we left at the end of last episode and that we just answered here at the beginning of the show. Could you name the 3 Aztecs that were part of the 1990 World Cup team? So we just gave those answers. So let's go ahead and do our kind of mid-episode here trivia question. And this one, as we said, is going to be nearly identical. There were 3 SDSU Aztecs that were also part of the 1994 World Cup roster. How many can you name? So we will give those answers, and I will just say it's not the same 3, but there could be some overlap there between some of the players. So we'll answer that after we do our segment on the 1990 Men's World Cup roster. Dylan, do you have any we'll hold them, till after the episode. But do you have any ideas of who one or more of those players might be?
I mean, I, yeah, I'm gonna just take an educated guess. We'll call it, but yeah, I might have one idea.
All right. Well, I'm going to give a hint to anybody who is listening or watching here on our YouTube channel. If you watched the send-off game by the U.S. men's national team against Germany, there were 15 players honored that were part of that 1994 roster before the match. All three of those SDSU players were there. So if you watched any of the pregame and before that, when they honored those players, you have a chance of getting them here. But again, we'll do the answer after the segment here on the 1990 World Cup team and their connection to the SDSU Aztecs. All right. With that said, Dylan, any comments before we jump in?
No, I think let's dive right in.
All right. So, as we all know, 1990 marked the return of the U.S. men's national team to the World Cup finals after a 40-year absence. And with no professional outdoor league and, excuse me, the 1994 World Cup coming to the United States, U.S. men's national team at the time, head coach at the time, Bob Gansler, he made a conscious decision to bring a roster of mostly current and former outdoor college soccer players rather than rely heavily on current MISL pros, since that was our only quote unquote professional men's league at the time. California colleges represented heavily on that squad, accounting for 8 of the final 22-man roster, because that's what it was back in 1990, a 22-man roster. Soccer powerhouse UCLA led with 4 players on the squad, but right behind was SDSU with 3 players. As we said before, Marcelo Balboa, Chris Sullivan, and Eric Wynalda. All 3 of them would see action on the field in Italy. In fact, all 3 of them would see action in the very first game, but we'll talk about this a little more later. Unfortunately, due to Eric Wynalda's red card, they weren't all on the field at the same time. Together, since Chris Sullivan and Marcelo Balboa both came in as subs. Okay, so tonight we're going to look at the path to SDSU for each of these players, as well as the U.S. men's national team. We'll look briefly at their performances in the 1990 World Cup, but then really look at their post-1990 World Cup careers and their soccer legacies. Because certainly in San Diego, two of those players, Marcelo Balboa and Eric Wynalda, certainly get a lot of recognition. Chris Sullivan, not as much, but in some ways he really ought to. And I think part of this is to really shine a bit of a spotlight on one of the lesser known of the 3 Aztecs that made that particular World Cup squad. All right, in doing this, I have to say I found the prep for this episode incredibly difficult. There are so many moving pieces and trying to keep track of where players' pathways crossed between Olympic qualifying and CONCACAF qualifying and under 20 qualifying and all the craziness that was going on not only in our country but the world in the 80s. It was tough, and especially through the 70s and 80s, because we had a huge change in our media landscape. There's huge changes going on in the economic and political landscapes, which both of those had an effect on our changing U.S. sporting landscape. So as we tell tonight's story, we will touch on some of those areas as well, like we usually do, to provide a little deeper context as we tell our stories. But we'll try very hard not to get too far off base in some of those other areas, because there were some very significant events around this time period that we're talking about in our world events that were going on in this time period we're talking about for our soccer story. All right, so Dylan, with that said, any comments before we dive in? And we'll try to tell this chronologically like we do most of our stories, and we're going to go back to when they were born. But before we actually do that, have any thoughts or comments before we start telling the stories here?
Yeah, I just think it's funny that we haven't even gotten into it yet. We've already mentioned an Eric Wynalda red card. That sounds about right.
And, I almost thought to do this as a trivia question. First U.S. men's national team player in history to get a red card at the World Cup. So we'll talk briefly about that. But yes, and especially for that point in his career, I wouldn't say to a lot of people who knew him wasn't um, wasn't terribly surprising. That was just part of his character and his nature. I think a little bit aggressive. Some might say hot-headed, but some of that hot-headedness and confidence, maybe even overconfidence, is what also made him a great goal scorer. And the willingness to, I think he was the first player we really had who had what looked like from someone who watched, and I was at San Diego State at the same time as these players, so I am roughly the same age as them. And not all the players, not when Chris Sullivan was there, but when Marcelo Balboa and Eric Wynalda were there, and watching them play, he was one of the few American players that I ever thought he could take on any defender in the world, and really, I think that helped him be as successful as he was. But also, as you said, not surprising about the red card.
I will say as well, just a little personal anecdote. Back in the USL Twitter days before it became X and I deleted my account, Eric Wynalda was the most famous person who ever followed me.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. I was tweeting about some bullshit about the USL and he followed me. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, because he coached Lights for a while there, right?
Yeah, he did. So. Right. And that first season especially, that was our very first game with the Loyals.
So. That's right.
So it was Landon Donovan versus Eric Wynalda as well as the two teams. So that was made that game, made the storylines for that opening game for the Loyal interesting on multiple levels. All right, let's get back to our three players here, and we'll start with their births. They were all born in the 60s. They were all raised in California. Chris Sullivan is the oldest. He was born in 1965 up in San Jose, California, so closer to your neck of the woods there, Dylan. Marcelo Balboa was born 2 years later in 67. He was actually born in Chicago, Illinois, because his father played for the Chicago Mustangs in the NASL. And but as he finished a couple years later, they relocated to Cerritos, California, and that's where Marcelo Balboa grew up. Eric Wynalda was born 2 years after that in 1969 in Fullerton, California, but grew up for most of his youth in Westlake Village, California. So all born in the 60s, so all kind of grew up playing soccer as youths in the 70s. And a couple of things about the 70s as we dive into it. From a media standpoint, the 70s saw a sharp decline in afternoon newspapers as more people turned to their local nightly evening news and nightly network news. And again, as a child and a product of the 70s and 80s, I mean, I remember this distinctly. And when I think about the differences of those times compared to today, there were 3 networks. Everybody got their local news and their national news basically from one of those 3 networks. There were still morning papers, but afternoon papers started to really go, as we said, on a decline during the 70s. But what we did start to see a rise in a proliferation were of specialty magazines and newspapers. For example, Soccer America started in 1971 up in the Bay Area, as well as originally Soccer West, but I think within a year they changed to Soccer America because they were already just covering a whole bunch of things going on with soccer. I had a subscription to Soccer America for a good part of my late youth and early college years and early adulthood. It was like my Bible. I couldn't wait for it to come every week because you didn't get stuff on the news and television. It wasn't broadcast on the soccer wasn't broadcast much on the networks outside of maybe some games for the NASL. So having a magazine like Soccer America was fantastic to see what was going on across the country in terms of soccer. Yeah, you got it maybe a week late, but you got it where the local newspapers, they'd be covering bigger events, but not necessarily everything that was happening in college and college level and Herman Trophy and youth tournaments at that time. So for someone like me, having a publication like Soccer America was fantastic. But we also had lots of other ones that were associated with the NASL and other areas, even if you wanted to get a subscription and get it mailed to you from Europe as well. So we started to see that change, especially in the 70s. Also in the 70s, it really ushered in the beginnings of cable television and satellite television. And when I say satellite, I'm talking the old big 5-foot dish satellite, that people might have in their backyard, not the direct TV things that came later. But same idea of being able to then subscribe and see programs and channels, things from around the world. We look at something like ESPN, started in 1979, along with other cable packages and subscriptions, and you had your HBOs and your movie channels and your other kind of things that started to enter people's homes into the late 70s and 80s. So the viewing options dramatically increased over the time period that these players were playing. So not only did they get the opportunity to see more soccer at different levels, there was access to specialty magazines like Soccer America. Youth soccer in California, very well established at that time, especially in certain pockets of the state. I mean, we had a booming youth soccer scene going in a lot of places in the 60s and then into the 70s. But the 70s, it really exploded. We saw an explosion of additional teams, leagues, clubs, which helped increase the competitive levels. Because again, at the club soccer level, we started getting tiered levels starting. So you have more competitive and less competitive leagues for players. And all three of our future stars were certainly able to take advantage of some of these newer soccer environments that were really growing in the 70s. In terms of politics, there were too many to mention during the 70s of significant international events, but towards the very end of the decade, we have the Iranian Revolution, which led directly to the hostage crisis that we had. And then you had the Soviets' invasion of Afghanistan. And those two events, the culmination and how those events played out also had a bit of a effect on international sporting competitions. And we'll talk about that as we get into the 80s, because what we certainly started to see a lot more of in our country was a much more strongly patriotic support for all U.S. international competitions, and especially if you were facing anyone from the East, the Soviets and anybody from the Soviet bloc. So before we get in and dig into the 80s a little more deeply, Dylan, do you have any thoughts or comments?
Not particularly. I've actually been reading about the 79, I guess, into 80 hostage crisis a lot recently on my own, and how that effectively ended Jimmy Carter's administration. There were other things going on, but the inflation that came after that, the gas rationing. So yeah, interesting, not in a positive way necessarily, but interesting time in American politics for sure.
Yes, and hugely influential, I think, and we'll talk about it here in just a second, in some of our major international sporting events, especially through the early 80s. So let's dig into that in the early 80s. The very first thing we saw in the 80s, in February of 1980, was the Winter Olympics. And of course, looking back on it now, probably the single biggest thing people remember from that Winter Olympics is the 1980 men's hockey team and the whole miracle on ice. Their run to the gold medal. And I don't think I can overstate how important that was to the American sports psyche. For someone who grew up and watched it and witnessed everything that was happening at that time, for anybody who wasn't alive at that time. But what effect that really had because of the backdrop of other things that were going on in the world. So just to go over that quickly for people who may not be quite as familiar or maybe only just saw the movie, right? The Disney movie on it. But US was hosting the Winter Olympics in Lake Placid, New York. It was the first Olympics held in the US in 20 years since the 1960 Winter Games in Squaw Valley. It's the first Olympics now after the end of politically, which usually referred to as the period of détente between the United States and the Soviet Union due to the Soviets' invasion of Afghanistan. It's also being held a few months after the start of the Iranian hostage crisis. And, we've already started to get the yellow ribbons and everything going around in support of both the families and of the people who are being held hostage at the embassy. So yellow ribbons abound at this time. And you have this run by this U.S. men's hockey team that's basically made up of college players. And they go on, the big event is them beating the Soviets in the semifinals of the hockey tournament. And it was huge because the Soviet team is ranked as the best hockey team in the world. They've won the last 4 gold medals. They're going for their 5th straight gold medal. They're said to have the best goalkeeper in the entire world. And this is one of those things where, from an American standpoint, the Olympics were very much an amateur sporting competition. Professional athletes did not participate in this, but everybody from the West also thought that, well, the Soviets basically have professionals. I mean, that's what these people do. They're technically, a lot of times they talk about being with the military, but they're training and playing full-time hockey players. So there was always already a chip on the shoulder from people in the West about being unfair and using professional players. And the conversations even back then, well, if we used our professional players, like from the NHL, it would be very different, which as we know now is very different because we do have professional players who go to the Olympics. So the US get matched up against the Soviets in the semifinal match. It ends 2-2 at the end of the first period, and the Russian coach pulls the goalkeeper. He's so upset and frustrated that the Americans, of all people, have scored 2 goals against the Soviets. He pulls the goalkeeper. And I think as someone who is watching that and listening to Al Michaels' commentary and everything, and just the discussions, because I was middle school-ish, probably. Yeah, I guess it was about 8th grade. And didn't know a ton of hockey or hockey players or Olympics at the time, but just listening to all the explanation and just people just stunned that the American team had forced what is arguably the best goalkeeper in the world out of the tournament at the end of the first period. And a lot of the fans recognize this. And again, you got the USA chants, and it's, energy is building. Well, in the second period, the Soviets go up 3-2, and that's how the second period ends. So they seem to have better control over the game, but the US team comes out in the third period, scores 2 goals, ends up winning 4-3. And, that is the miracle game, really, beating the Soviets there. And then making it to the finals where they do beat Finland 4-2 and take the gold medal. But that was, again, it felt like the biggest underdog story ever at that time. And again, as someone who grew up watching this, and actually I was supposed to be working. I didn't even call in to not go to work. I was so engrossed in the game, I just didn't go to my shift. And probably actually shouldn't have been working doing anything as an 8th grader, but those are different times. So, but yeah, the ripple effect of this, the US bunch of college kids beating the mighty Soviets, had certain ripple effects across both international sports and politics for that at that time. Before we go on with any further, I'll give you a chance, Dylan, if you want to jump in for anything about the 1980 Olympics.
Not particularly. I only realized Lake Placid was in New York at an embarrassingly late stage of my life, is really all I have to say. I don't know. I just never really thought that hard about it, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. And, at the time, it was a well-covered event, so I had never heard of Lake Placid before the Olympics, as a kid. But then all the stories and everything else, like you do at any Olympics, you get to know about the community and the place. But it also feels like it was one of the last Winter Olympics that was really at a very small place, and not like the Winter Olympics or even the Summer Olympics are now, or much more well attended by people from around the world, a lot more teams competing, a lot more venues. Um, it does feel like Lake Placid is a tiny place, but at that time, still able to host, I guess, the Winter Olympics. And again, because we're going to be talking about the Winter and Summer Olympics. At this time, the Winter and Summer Olympics were always held in the same year. It wasn't until I think '94 in Lillehammer where we actually did the off rotation between Winter Olympics and Summer Olympics, when too many of the Olympic federations complained that it was too hard to prepare athletes both for a Winter Olympics and a Summer Olympics in the same calendar year. So up until that point, the Winter Olympics and the Summer Olympics were always in the same year, because that brings us to our next point. These Olympics have finished, right? The U.S. is super happy, especially with the hockey team and their victory. But in March, the month after these Olympics finish, President Carter announced at that time that the U.S. is going to boycott the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow, primarily due to the Soviets' invasion of Afghanistan, among other things, but that's the big stated reason. And more than 60 other countries follow the Americans' lead and also boycott the Summer Olympics, which heightens a lot more of the political rhetoric going back and forth between the East and West, because after this period of détente, you get a lot more challenging kind of languages between the two countries, confrontational kind of language, but also some more posturing in terms of sports and the politics and sports crossing over. So Carter announces we're boycotting the 1980 Olympics. And in terms of soccer, the frustrating thing about that is we qualified for the 1980 Olympics, but our soccer team doesn't get to go. So some of the gains we had been making through the 70s, we miss out on the Summer Olympics. Later that year in 1980, October, November, we have the championship qualification, kind of their current version of the Hex. It was was 6 teams that made it to the final round. But it was an interesting way they split it up to qualify for the 1982 Olympics. So late 1980, they're doing starting the qualifications for the 1982 World Cup. But the way they did the Hex is they divided CONCACAF into its 3 main regions: the North American region, the Central American region, and the Caribbean region. And those teams from each of those sub-regions played each other, and the top 2 made it. So the North American region is only made up of Canada, US, and Mexico. So those 3 played each other to see who were the 2 that would make it to the Hex. And US finishes dead last. So they don't qualify for the 1992 World Cup. In Spain is where it's going to be. So we don't have much that happens in 1981. So we're going to jump to 1982 to that World Cup in Spain. In terms of the US and our expanding broadcast and cable television, it becomes the best covered and therefore most watched in the US World Cup ever, because we do have something like ESPN now. So ABC does air the final. ESPN shows several of the other matches on their new cable channel, and PBS does daily highlight show with Toby Charles. And for those who may or may not know, Toby Charles had a show on PBS that was called Soccer Made in Germany. It was a 1-hour show where they took a Bundesliga match and condensed it to an hour, and fit it into a PBS time slot so you could watch it. And I was one of those people who watched that religiously because it was one of the only places I could get some soccer, and felt like live soccer, even though it wasn't. But it was one of the few times I could actually watch some soccer. But that's what we had: ABC, ESPN, and PBS doing, your coverage. So again, more and more people are starting to get exposed to the World Cup, more players. So as our 3 players that we're following are finishing high school, kind of getting into that stage here, they're able to see a lot more soccer. And soccer is starting to seem to more and more people like, if you're good at something you could possibly do after college. There's some competition and things you could compete in. All right. Actually, I'll pause there for a second in case there's anything you want to jump in with before we get to 1983.
No, not particularly. It's nice to know that the more national kind of broadcasters were starting to give it a look. And I I'm sure this was when ESPN was, still better than the TMZ for sports it is today.
Right.
Which is, too bad. But this is obviously 12 years before I'm born. So this is all, kind of news to me.
Yeah. And it was an easy thing for ESPN to pick up and do because they were looking for sports and sports properties to do because they were covering everything. It was crazy at the time when ESPN started, the stuff that they would show. It wasn't tiddlywinks competitions, but practically they would show the craziest stuff. I got introduced to so many different sports through ESPN, and it was just fun watching all the crazy stuff that they put on at all hours of the day, which isn't the same anymore because now they are much larger and they do have broadcast rights to a lot of the top leagues, which is what they were going for at the time, but they just weren't quite there yet, which then was a huge advantage for soccer fans at that time in 1982. In 1983, Colombia, who was supposed to host the 1986 World Cup, has to back out. In 1982, the World Cup expands from 16 to 24 teams for the first time. So that added number of teams and what you need to do to host the tournament, that, among a bunch of other things, it put some pressure in Colombia. Colombia couldn't get guarantees from their government that they'd be able to pull off this tournament, so they have to back out. So in the spring, in March of 1983, FIFA is looking for bids. Brazil had put in a bid but pulled out, and ultimately it ended up with just 3 bids. And they happened to be our current hosts for the 2026 World Cup. Canada, United States, and Mexico were the only 3 that put in a bid, and probably the only countries that had enough of an infrastructure to be able to pull this off, just a couple years out from the 86 World Cup to be able to do it. All 3 put in a bid, but in March, the special 5-person FIFA committee fails to recommend the Canadian or the USA bids to the executive committee, leaving only the Mexican bid as the one to be considered, which, even though it wasn't formally voted on for a couple months, at that point, everybody knew the US doesn't have a chance of getting the World Cup. But even still, there were a lot of politicians, Henry Kissinger being one of them, who really tried to pull out all the stops to try to convince FIFA to reconsider before that vote. We even had, resolutions passed in Congress and other things for us to host, but it was pretty much a done deal by this March meeting of the 5-person special committee, since they only recommended the Mexican bid. And there were a lot of people within FIFA like, why? Why would you give it, especially to the US? I don't know all the things about Canada, but why would you even consider the US? They're not a soccer country. And that Mexico had a great World Cup back in 1970. So it seemed like, I think for the people who were, if you follow in line of the cronyism within FIFA, it was probably an easy decision to go to Mexico and not risk going to the US or someone else, US or Canada, for the others. So that happens early in 83, but also 83 is when Chris Sullivan graduates from high school. He was a star athlete in all kinds of sports. He set school football records. I believe he was a receiver. He was a good basketball player. So in California, we do soccer and basketball the same season during the winter season. So he had to choose between soccer and basketball when he was freshman in high school and chose soccer. And he chose to play for college. He chose to play soccer, and he chose to go to college to SDSU. And SDSU had had some very good years leading up to this. And the 1980s are really considered the golden era for SDSU men's soccer. But 1983, when Chris Sullivan does come and play for the Aztecs in the fall, the team went 9-9-4 for the season. It's one of their, I think it was their worst season of the 1980s because they had just suffered heavy graduation losses. Sullivan got decent playing time as a freshman, scored goals, but it ended up being his only season at SDSU, and at the end of the school year, he would transfer to the University of Tampa. So we'll still pick up his story and what happens after this, but he has, a decent year as a freshman coming in. But as I think we'll see, and I think something to me that marks Chris Sullivan is he is not afraid to get out and try something new or just stick around with something. If he wants to do it or there's something he wants to try, he's willing to pick up everything and go. And we'll see more about that a little bit later in his career. In 1984, in May, on the eve of the vote for the 1990 World Cup, so FIFA's selecting the 1990 World Cup, the Soviets announced that they're going to boycott the 1984 Olympics, which are going to be held in Los Angeles, right? So U.S. boycotts Summer Olympics in Moscow. Moscow turns around and Soviets turn around and decide they're going to boycott, along with most of the Eastern Bloc countries, they're going to boycott the Summer Olympics in 84 as retaliation. But the very next day is the vote by FIFA to decide who's going to host the 1990 World Cup, and it comes down to Italy and the Soviet Union. And there's a lot of speculation by people. I don't know that I couldn't find any records of people directly in the room who voted, but there's certainly a lot of speculation around that vote that decision by the Soviets on the eve of the vote pretty much killed their chance of hosting the 1990 World Cup. So Italy ends up hosting the 1990 World Cup. The Soviets claim corruption by Havelange, who's the president at the time, and Coca-Cola, who's the main big sponsor of FIFA, and of course it's an American or US company. So the Soviets make lots of complaints about corruption. Looking back and at the times and everything, maybe not unfounded at all with all the corruption we know that happens in FIFA, but certainly the timing of their decision to boycott the 84 Olympics didn't help their World Cup chances. So Italy then becomes only the second country after Mexico in 86 hosting the World Cup. They're going to host a World Cup for the second time. We do end up having the Olympics there in 84. We have a hugely successful soccer, men's soccer at the 1984 Olympics. And just huge stadiums. The Rose Bowl was filled for a variety of games. And that happens to be organized, for those who don't know, by someone called Alan Rothenberg. And, Alan Rothenberg, who goes on to become the president of U.S. Soccer and chairman of Major League Soccer and the organizer for the 1994 World Cup. But that's kind of where he gets his start in World Cup organizing. You have, and then we know Chris Sullivan transfers, as we said before, to the University of Tampa. I'm going to finish up 1985, and then we're going to get some comments and thoughts from you, Dylan. So 1985, in March, is when we officially have the NASL closing shop. Their last season was 84. They tried to get another season going, but they had so few teams, and eventually all the teams just say, we're not doing it. The U.S. men's national team loses to Costa Rica and Torrance, so they get eliminated from 1986 World Cup qualification. We talked a lot about that in our episode on Kevin Crowe, that particular match, because he was in there. The Cosmos, the storied New York Cosmos, fold in June. And that was probably the low point for U.S. soccer. In 1985, everything seems to come tumbling down a little bit. And you know, there's a lot of talk within U.S. soccer that we really need to make a change. For us in our story, the one bright spot is Marcelo Balboa. He's wrapped up high school the same year. But of course, as an avid soccer player and being more aware of all these things going on, you are aware. He ends up enrolling at Cerritos College, a junior college, and plays there where he plays soccer, and he's also the place kicker for the football team. So Marcelo Balboa is going to spend a couple years at Cerritos College before he comes over to SDSU. But as we said, 85 really for U.S. soccer in terms of the men's program really kind of becomes the low point. So Dylan will give you a chance to jump in before we see the turnaround in 1986. And as we start to see more of our three players here from SDSU get more involvement in our national teams.
Really just one question. What was the gap between NASL folding and the Phoenix organization, or I don't even know how related they were? Because I know there was like at least 2, maybe 3 iterations of the NASL across the years, the most recent folding, I think in 2017-ish. So what was the gap between 85 and whenever it
Well, there
restarted?
was some kind of, and I can't remember the name of it, and I don't think it was an iteration of the ASL again, but there was something that happened for a year right after the NASL, but it wasn't the NASL.
Okay.
I believe there were only 2. It was the
Okay.
second one that came around in the 2010s, the break off when they had the split of the teams in USL Pro to form NASL, the new version of the NASL, along with the USL. Which led to eventually our court cases that we had against U.S. Soccer once that league folded. But quite a big gap. I mean, there really was no effective pro league once the NASL folded officially in 85, but last season being 84. And really our pro soccer and where most people's attention really pushed towards was major indoor soccer league. And that's where players went. That's where the fans went. That was the only soccer outside of college. And I shouldn't say the only soccer. There were still some attempts at getting outdoor leagues going through the late 80s and the early 90s until we got Major League Soccer. The A-League being one of, I guess, the more prominent ones. But they never really took hold. And I think they also never really took hold because of FIFA's insistence that the U.S. part of the thing for being awarded the 94 World Cup was to start a pro league, and the way U.S. soccer went about making that professional league kind of did not include any of the other groups that were really trying to keep soccer going after the NASL. That's a whole other podcast and story in itself. Sure. But yes, it was interesting and frustrating times in the period between the NASL and MLS, but there was outdoor soccer being played at that time, and high-level outdoor soccer. It just couldn't quite get the momentum and the backing of U.S. soccer to really take hold. Yeah. Story of a lot of our professional leagues, I think. Okay, so let's jump into 1986. U.S. Soccer decides to appoint Lothar Osiander as the new head coach of the U.S. men's national team because they're looking to, rebuild. We had qualified for the 80 Olympics, but we just basically had a whole bunch of failures. And then we really need to get going. Their first goal is to qualify for the 1986 World Cup. Osiander was hired partly because he just led the San Francisco Greek Americans to the National Challenge Cup, which we now know as the U.S. Open Cup. And he led them to the title. Also had connections with U.S. soccer overall, so he wasn't unknown to U.S. soccer and the coaching group. So he's hired to lead the U.S. men's national team. His very first goal was to qualify for the 1988 Summer Olympics in Seoul, South Korea. So again, it's 1986. But we also have, in August of 86, the CONCACAF Under-20 tournament, which is coached by Derek Armstrong, who, as anybody who's familiar with that here in San Diego knows, longtime coaching legend. here with the San Diego Nomads or Hoya Nomads Soccer Club. Also with UCSD for a while. So, huge coaching legend in the area. He takes over the under 20 team in 1986 for this CONCACAF qualifying tournament so they can qualify for the 1987 World Youth Championships. That's what the under 20 tournament was called. It's being hosted in Trinidad and Tobago. There's 2 rounds. All the rounds are being played in TNT and all in the month of August. So in the first round, the under 20s are in Group B with Cuba, Jamaica, Mexico, and Suriname. US and Cuba advance out of the group. During that group stage, the U.S. men's national team defeats Mexico 3-0, marking the first time a U.S. men's national team had defeated Mexico in a FIFA-sanctioned event since 1934, when the U.S. defeated Mexico to qualify for the 1934 World Cup. So huge news, even though it's at the under 20 level, but we just don't beat Mexico. The U.S. does not beat Mexico. They're lucky if they can tie. Mexico is always the one who's in the way, because almost everybody else, along with the U.S. at this time, are fairly even. Costa Rica beats us a lot of times. We beat Costa Rica. Guatemala, same. We split with El Salvador. We split with Jamaica. We split with Trinidad and Tobago. There's a lot of parity among all the other teams at this time, if you go back and look in terms of the results. But Mexico is clearly the standout of the Confederation. So we beat them 3-0. Mexico doesn't advance to, the under 20 tournament, but the U.S. eventually make it to the second round, and they advance with Canada to the 1987 World Youth Championships. What I had trouble finding, I know Marcelo Balboa was part of the team that made it to the championships, this under 20 team. I assume he was part of this group in 86 for the qualification, but I can't find any roster lineups, or at least I couldn't in the time frame we had to verify that he was actually part of the team. But he does end up captaining this under 20 team at the World Youth Championships. So my gut feeling is he was there, and especially because through the late 80s, Marcelo Balboa and Derek Armstrong had connections, because Balboa played with the Nomads when the Nomads were doing some professional teams in the late 80s. So I'm fairly certain he was there, but I can't confirm that in what I was able to find out. So that brings us to 1987, which we'll probably pause here just for a second again, get your thoughts, because 1987, in terms of both the U.S. men's national team and our players in connection to SDSU, this is kind of a golden year, 1987. So Dylan, we'll let you jump in with any thoughts or comments before we jump into 87.
I mean, I don't have much to add. It's nice to know that the U.S. had a good experience in Trinidad and Tobago once. My standout is 2017. So this seems like it went better.
Well, they had quite a few in this, few year period in the late 80s. So we'll talk about some of them here in a second. All right. So 1987 rolls around. One of the biggest thing that happens in January is Chris Sullivan. He's finished up his final year of soccer at the University of Tampa. But before he finishes his senior year of college, he decides in January to go try his hand in Europe. And he's one of the very first players to have a successful career in Europe. He goes over to France, able to pick up with a team in the lower leagues in France, and begins his European career. So unlike a lot of the American players who are, well, if they're in college, they're obviously in college, but outside of college, they're trying to find some kind of professional, semi-professional team to keep playing with, to keep their skills up, if they're not playing in major indoor soccer league. So he's one of the few that go to Europe to actually pursue a career, and helps open the door for other Americans later. And I think this is one of the reasons a lot of people don't hear as much about Chris Sullivan, is because he left. He left to go try his hand at soccer in Europe, because he was a pretty strong attacking player. All right, in May of that year, in 1987, we have and again, these names get a little confusing to keep track of everything. But we have the pre-Olympic tournament qualification. So there was kind of like we do for World Cup qualification. You have your final qualification, whether it's your hex with 6 teams or you have 8 teams or however many teams you have in that final, but we have other rounds to get for that qualification. This is one of those earlier rounds for Olympic qualification. And at this time for the Olympics, teams from CONMEBOL and Europe could only play under 23s because they were stronger. But other teams like the US, we could bring professional players. They hadn't made it a full under 23 tournament just yet. So the US, again, Oceanor's goal is to make it to the Olympics. And they have their first series is just a 2-leg series against Canada. Winner moves on, loser doesn't, right? Which is how they did a lot of these. You just kind of early on in CONCACAF qualifying, it's like, we're just going to match you up with someone. If you win, you move on. If you lose, you're done. US goes up to Canada and they lose 2-0, which puts them in a huge hole because the away goals tiebreaker is in effect. So not only did they lose, but they didn't score. And if Canada scores when you come back, it's going to make it a huge hurdle to try to advance to the Olympics. Lots of talk about whether we hired the right coach, right? We go in our first big test, we lose in Canada 2-0. They come back to the US and end up winning 3-0 to Canada. So huge goals by Paul Crumpy and Jim Gabara. And some people would argue, I'm not sure I'd agree, but some people would argue that these goals by these players and this victory, 3-2 over Canada, or 3-2 on aggregate victory over Canada, were hugely important, almost as much as Paul Galaguri's goal in 1989 to actually send us to the World Cup. Because without this, we don't go to the Olympics. And if we're not successful in the Olympics, do we have a chance in the CONCACAF qualifications? Do we change coaches again? So this was another one of those lesser known kind of turning points. So we knock out Canada, and it's also huge because Canada had qualified for the 1986 World Cup. So they were not a poor team by any stretch. Later on that year, so after we have moved on to the next stage of Olympic qualifying, Korea hosts, I forget the name of the tournament, but they invite teams. The Americans, the United States were one of the teams that came for a series of friendlies, small little tournament, basically so they could do a dry run of their Olympic soccer tournament before the actual Olympics start the next year. And in that series, Chris Sullivan makes his U.S. men's national team debut. In the first game, a 3-1 loss to Egypt, he comes on the 72nd minute for Brian Bliss. In the second game, a 1-0 loss to South Korea, he comes on at halftime, plays the full second half. A few days later, in a 1-0 victory over Thailand, he gets the start and plays the full 90. So this was his first 3 games with the U.S. men's national team. Looks like they kind of ease him in the beginning, but by the end of the tournament, he's starting. Later, for that same year in '87, Wynalda has graduated from high school, from Westlake High School, and comes to San Diego State, to Montezuma Mesa, and he is a highly regarded freshman coming on the team. He ends up starting and contributing right away. Now, San Diego State has a great forward who was a finalist for the Herman Trophy, Kyle Whitmore, at this time. I can't remember if he was a junior or senior when Wynalda shows up, but he's the main player for SDSU. But what's nice for Wynalda, since Kyle Whitmore gets so much attention and double teams, is it frees up Wynalda. And once Wynalda starts being successful, teams have to rely on him, which then frees up Kyle Whitmore as well. So they had a really good attack, San Diego State did, as well as defense at this time. And San Diego State starts a pretty successful college season in '87. And we're going to come back to that in a second. But in September, also, we actually have the full CONCACAF qualifying tournament for the 1988 Olympics. We've got the teams in the groups, and the United States really, like, this was the goal, qualify for the Olympics first. Well, the United States comes out swinging. They first match, they beat Trinidad and Tobago 4-1. They go down to TNT. They beat them 1-0, so they win both the legs against Trinidad and Tobago. And that starts that part of it. But then, squeezed in around the same time in October, we have the FIFA World Youth Championships. The U.S. does not advance out of their group with Derek Armstrong's team, but Marcelo Balboa is on the roster. He plays all the games. He captains the team. It's really, we're starting to see the rise of Marcelo Balboa on defense. He hasn't cracked the full national team yet, but he is one of the stars of the under-20 team at the FIFA World Youth Championships. A little later in October, we pick up with the qualifying tournament again, and the U.S. has their first match against El Salvador, which they win 4-2 down in El Salvador. So all that's left, U.S. is practically guaranteed their spot in the Olympics. Sorry, in the next round, but they just have to beat El Salvador. But that second El Salvador match is not going to be till the spring of '88, and I couldn't find out why there was such a delay. Like, we have all these others right in the fall of '87, but that fourth match that they need to play wouldn't be played till May of '88. But right after this, November, December, this is college playoffs, and San Diego State has their historic run to the College Cup. They make it to the Final Four. Part of the reason they make it to the Final Four is in the West Regional, SDSU goes up against UCLA, a team they haven't beaten since 1969. And freshman Eric Wynalda's goal seals the deal. He gets the game winner. They beat UCLA. They make it to the Final Four. They defeat Harvard in penalty kicks to make it to the finals, where they end up losing to Clemson, who is led by their standout player, Bruce Murray. And that's a name you're going to hear a little bit more of later for a couple of reasons. But they lose to Clemson by, easily the best tournament run that San Diego State has ever had, and Eric Wynalda, a big part of the contributions there, especially that game-winning goal against UCLA to send them to the Final Four. And that's really where '87 ends. We got Chris Sullivan playing in Europe. We've got Marcelo Balboa having standout time with the U.S. under-20s, and Eric Wynalda has one of his standout seasons helping to lead SDSU to the Final Four for the NCAA tournament. And with that, we'll pause. Dylan, see if you have any thoughts or comments.
No, not much to add. Just trying to keep track of the alternate timelines. We're just, well, not timelines, but you know what I mean. The different branches we're tracking here.
Right. This was with the hard for this episode, was all the different pieces here for these three players. All right, so let's jump into '88. The CONCACAF under-20 tournament begins. So this is now, the under-20 tournaments goes on 2-year cycles. So this is the next cycle for the under-20 tournament. We already had the one that Marcelo Balboa participated in. He's aged up now. He's not going to be in this batch of under-20. But the key person, there's two key reasons for talking about this particular under-20 group, because none of our players are involved with this next cycle of under-20s, but Bob Gansler becomes the coach of the under-20s, and Bob Gansler, if anybody knows their history, is the coach that leads the team to the 1990 World Cup. And there is another particular reason, which some people may already know what it is, but we'll get into it as we cover what happens in 1988. So Bob Gansler takes over the under-20 team. There are 10 CONCACAF teams competing for 2 spots in these World Youth Championships. Now, because of past problems from various confederations, FIFA sends out a warning to all confederations to do not attempt to deceive the football authorities regarding the age of players in any designated youth tournament. So big warning gets sent out. In the first round, like, the U.S. is split into, or the 10 teams are split into 2 groups of 5. You play everyone once. So U.S. is in a group with Costa Rica, Guatemala, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago. And in the opening match, we beat Trinidad and Tobago 4-1. We lose to Costa Rica. We beat Jamaica. We beat Guatemala. So we finish second to Costa Rica. So then we get to go to the under 20, the next round of the under 20 tournament, which is going to be a little bit later in the year. And those 4 teams that make it to the second round, which is done here in April, Costa Rica, Cuba, Mexico, and the US. So top 2 will go to the 1989 World Youth Championships. And like in a normal 4-group kind of tournament, you're going to play everybody once. You're going to play it at who's ever hosting the site, which in this case is, I think, could be Guatemala. And the tournament starts. We have the first match. Costa Rica defeats the U.S. men's national team. Again, this is the under 20 tournament. Costa Rica wins 3-1. But a story comes out in Mexico. A Mexican journalist, Antonio Moreno, citing the own Mexican Federation historical publications and historical documents, starts pointing out there appear to be players on this team that are overage, and in his article points out the risks of playing overage players after FIFA just made this big announcement to not do it. The journalist, he ends up getting verbally attacked by the Mexican Football Federation leadership, but other journalists start digging into the story. And frankly, because of the Federation's own historical documents, it's pretty easy to verify that Mexico is playing with at least 4 overage players in the under 20 tournament. It becomes a big scandal in the Mexican press. And we have to remember, this is 1988. It's not today's environment where a story can go somewhere and it gets picked up and it's viral and everybody knows it in 10 minutes, right? This had to, people had to find out about it, maybe within Mexico, and then share the information with people in the US and get eventually to the US Soccer Federation. And when they heard about this, because the US finishes 3rd in the tournament, Mexico finishes 2nd, Costa Rica 1st. So Costa Rica and Mexico should go to the under 20 tournament. The United States appeals to FIFA. And Guatemala, who hosted this tournament, joins the appeal as well. So that was in April. Before FIFA has their ruling, the US has their last match against El Salvador, and they beat El Salvador 4-1. So they're going to make it to the next round of the Olympic qualifying. They're going to make it to the Olympics in 1988. But in June, FIFA publishes its decision on the United States appeal for it. And they said Mexico did use overage players in a youth tournament. So that Mexico team, even though they had qualified for the 1989 World Youth Championships, they're disqualified from it. And the U.S. takes their place since they were the 3rd place team. So the U.S. gets to compete in this under 20 tournament. Now, Mexico, 3 days after that, so June 22nd in 1988, they appealed to FIFA, saying that, well, I don't know what they were saying exactly in that appeal, but they appealed to FIFA. And then 8 days later, on June 30th, FIFA not only upholds that ban on them, their disqualification from the under 20 tournament, but it also bans all Mexican teams from international tournaments for 2 years. All teams, every level, including their senior team. The ban is retroactive to the 25th of April, which would have been the day after the under 20 tournament ended, which means Mexico is also disqualified from the Olympics. So Guatemala was the team that came in 3rd. So they get bumped into the Olympics with the United States. And they are effectively then banned from qualifying for the 1990 World Cup. So this opens the door, right? Mexico has always been the Achilles heel, not just for the U.S., for every team in the Confederation. So now Mexico is out, and it's a pretty wide open competition for everybody to qualify for this 1990 World Cup. Now, previous punishments for using overage players in FIFA youth tournaments kind of amounted a little more effectively to a slap on the wrist. They really only affected the youth team being banned. But FIFA made that big warning at the beginning, and FIFA said, those past sanctions we didn't have really any effect on curbing the problem of clubs playing overage players in youth tournaments. So FIFA stated that this more severe punishment, including affecting the senior men's team, was to serve as a strong warning to all federations. So there's a lot of things that tie together. So we're 1988 on July 4th, 1988. So less than a week after FIFA's big ban on Mexico, there's a vote for who's going to host the 1994 World Cup. It's between the US, Brazil, and Morocco. And on the very first vote, US gets more than 50% of the voting. Now, there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there, especially in Mexico, that the extra harsh punishment that the Mexicans received was put into place to help clear a path for the US to qualify for the 1990 World Cup in order to generate interest and build momentum for their hosting of the 94 World Cup. And especially for, as we know, a country that has never hosted the tournament before, and at that point still had not qualified for the World Cup in 38 years. So that's where we'll stop there for a second before we finish the rest of the year. But Dylan, any thoughts or comments at this point?
I didn't realize. So they were at what, 24 teams by the 1990 World Cup, right? Or was that the first one where they expanded to 24 teams?
82 was the first time they went to 24
right.
teams. Yeah.
So, but they hadn't expanded to 32 yet, correct? That was,
it was
like
not till 98.
Okay, that's what I thought. So how do you know off the top of your head how many slots CONCACAF would have been given? Like, was Mexico being two? Okay, so Mexico being banned isn't necessarily the reason they qualified, but it played a role. I didn't realize that. I somehow missed
Mexico
that.
almost always gets one of the spots.
Right.
Very rarely does Mexico not get a spot. So Mexico is usually a spot because they are the dominant team in CONCACAF. And then the other spot's kind of up for grabs for everybody else to fight for. Now, sometimes Mexico would come in second within qualification. They wouldn't always come in first, but highly unusual that Mexico would not be one of the two teams to qualify. So yes, it doesn't open the door just for the US. It opens the door for everyone, certainly. And Guatemala now gets to go to the Olympics as well. So really this was huge. And I think, did it kind of seal the deal here? Of course not. I mean, the US still has to win. All the other teams also feel like they have a shot. So, but did it take one piece out of the equation of qualifying? Of course it did. But, I think, I don't know, you never know with FIFA and the corruption that we know, and especially sometimes that we find out after the fact. So I think it's very easy to play into these conspiracy theories because we know of the corruption of FIFA. But I think really hard to say if it wasn't just what it was stated. They made the announcement ahead of time. You played with an overage player, other sanctions didn't work. We're doing a harsh sanction to get the message out to everyone. Could actually be the entire reason, has nothing to do with anything else. But again, with FIFA's corruption, who knows, right? Who knows? All right, so we get back into qualifying for our normal CONCACAF qualifying. And again, this was the CONCACAF tournament. At this point, qualifying for the Olympics, this didn't change till after the 90 World Cup. What we now know as the Gold Cup, which started in 91, the Gold Cup was just the CONCACAF, Confederation tournament that we had. And then the top two or whatever spaces we had would also qualify for the World Cup. It served both purposes, which it stopped doing that after the 90 World Cup. We had a specific qualification process for the World Cup, and then we had our Confederation tournament. But prior to this, at this point, they are the same thing. So this is why it usually takes place, like someone's hosting the tournament somewhere. But not always. Sometimes you still play at a home and home series. But the U.S. starts some of their matches where they beat Jamaica 5-1 at home. And let's see, I'm losing my thought here. We tied them away in Jamaica. We beat them at home. So we get, for those two legs, we have a 5-1 aggregate victory over Jamaica. In August of that year, Marcelo Balboa leaves Cerritos College, comes over to SDSU, joins Eric Wynalda on the SDSU roster. Since SDSU has had a couple of very good seasons, right? Just the year before made it to the finals of the College Cup. So Marcelo Balboa comes to SDSU, helps anchor the defense. We do have the Summer Olympics happen in September of '88 in Seoul, South Korea. Chris Sullivan does make that team. He is the youngest player taken on that Olympic roster because, again, we can bring professional players over there when a couple of the main confederations cannot. We get grouped with Argentina, South Korea, and the Soviet Union. We don't make it out of the group. We end up losing 4-2 to the Soviet Union, who go on to win the gold medal at those Olympics. And then later on in October, right after the Olympics, we have a friendly with Guatemala. We were the two teams that made it to the Olympics. We both got knocked out early. There's a friendly in Guatemala, and then that's where Marcelo Balboa gets his first senior national team cap. He starts along with Chris Sullivan. I think they both went the full 90. Marcelo Balboa definitely went the full 90 minutes on that one. And again, so we're starting to see like Chris Sullivan's being integrated to the team. Marcelo Balboa is starting to be integrated into the team after his strong showing at the Under-20 World Cup. And then we get to 1989. So in 1989, U.S. Soccer decides they need a full-time coach. Like we're going to host the 94 World Cup. We have to make sure we qualify for this 1990 World Cup. So they need a full-time coach. They hire Bob Gansler. I only saw this in one source. I'm not sure if this is accurate or not. I wasn't able to find out, but the other source said that Lothar Osiander did not want to take the job as a full-time coach. He had a job doing something else. He did this part-time on the side. So according to that source, he didn't want. So I don't know what it was because Osiander left with a 13-7 record. He had qualified them for the second stage, the actual World Cup qualifying. And Bob Gansler then, he helped qualify the Under-20 team, but remember they came in third. They're getting to go to the World Youth Championships because, of Mexico getting disqualified. And there certainly was some questions and concerns. Was Gansler the right person to lead the team at this point and become our first full-time national team coach? So Gansler's very first thing is the World Youth Championships, that even though he's hired as full national team coach, he's still wrapping up his Under-20 duties for the World Youth Championships. He takes them over in the spring, and even though we kind of backed into that tournament, he helps lead the U.S. to a 4th place finish, losing to Brazil in the 3rd place game. So one of our best finishes ever for our youth teams. So now it's looking like, hey, we did hire the right guy. This is really good. He helps, then starts leading us in the CONCACAF championships. We have some, we're not going to go through all the results. We know how it ends up. We know Paul Caligiuri's goal in Trinidad and Tobago. But in some of those early matches, Marcelo Balboa plays and starts, especially in the Costa Rica series. But he doesn't play all of them. It feels like Gansler kind of went with some older, more experienced players when it really got close and down in Trinidad and Tobago. Hard to find, again, lineups and rosters. You can see who played and who the subs were, but to see the subs that entered the match. But to see the unused subs is very difficult to find in the record. So I'm not sure if Balboa was even on the roster of some of those, key teams when it came down to those final games of qualifying. But we do. We end up qualifying, and then, that gets us into 1990. But I guess before we leave that, in August of 89, Gansler, for some friendlies, was going to bring in Wynalda into the national team camp. But unfortunately, Wynalda was sick with mono. He actually misses, I think, the first 2 months or something like that of the SDSU season. So he misses his first opportunity with the national team. He misses part of the SDSU season there in 89, and would not finally get his chance to get on the national team till 1990. So we'll kind of getting close to wrapping this up. But Dylan, before we get into 1990, any thoughts or comments?
Not particularly. Just didn't expect to see. I guess I knew Czechoslovakia was still a country in 1990. It didn't click for me until just now that would have been a country we could have been drawn against.
Yeah. So I guess I didn't do the actual draw. So at the end of that year, forgot to mention that. So it actually happens on Pearl Harbor Day for us, December 7th. We get drawn into Group A with Italy, the host nation, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. So, excuse me, in January of 1990, Wynalda finally gets his call into the January camp, which is held in La Jolla. I believe it was on the campus of UCSD. Could not find specific, roster of who was there, but I believe Chris Sullivan and Balboa were also part of the camp, because as we look at some of those early games, they seem to be in the lineups as well. So I assume they were all at the camp. Wynalda definitely was. It was his first time in the camp, but really the first time that these three start playing together. And we still haven't named the final roster yet, but we're starting to get closer to what that final roster is going to look like. Wynalda makes his international debut against Costa Rica on February 2nd. Chris Sullivan gets his first U.S. men's national team goal on the 13th of February. And in March, Wynalda signs a contract with U.S. Soccer, so foregoing his final year of eligibility of college soccer, signs a professional contract with U.S. Soccer. And for those who don't know, this is what happened. There wasn't, especially with the U.S. men's national team leading up to the 94 World Cup, U.S. Soccer behaved like a club. These national team players were signed with professional contracts with U.S. Soccer, and U.S. Soccer, if they, went somewhere else, got the transfer fee or whatever it was for them. So Wynalda actually signed a professional contract with U.S. Soccer to become a professional soccer player and start to be part of this pool of players that was going to become the national team. And, there were a series of friendlies. We won't get all of them as they start solidifying the team, but the team finally gets named. Balboa's on the team. Wynalda's on the team. Chris Sullivan is on the team as well. And we finally get to the World Cup. So in 1990, we have the opening match on June 10th. First time the U.S. men's team has played a World Cup match in 40 years, and they're up against Czechoslovakia. Wynalda gets the start. He's the only one of the three. Balboa and Sullivan are both on the bench. And I'd seen some reports, I don't know if it is, that Balboa, even though he has been one of the defenders, he's certainly in the mix of being one of the starting defenders. I saw some reports that he didn't get the start as more of a reward to those defenders that got the U.S. men's national team through those final games of qualification. But we'll see as we go through the games, Balboa then immediately starts getting into the rotation here for the U.S. men's national team. But we face Czechoslovakia. It doesn't go well. we are down 3-0 in the second half, early in the second half. In the 52nd minute, just 2 minutes. So Czechoslovakia is up 3-0 by the 50th minute. In the 52nd minute, Wynalda gets a red card. First, as we said earlier, U.S. men's national team player to receive a red card in a World Cup match. Was very unfortunate because Caligiuri would score in the 60th minute to make it 3-1. And even though probably not going to win the game, at least, again, we're hearing all kinds of stories about the debutantes in this 2026 World Cup. But being a debutant in this 1990 World Cup and playing with basically college players or players just out of college against all these professional players who play for professional clubs around the world, it was certainly not going to be easy. And while it's still 3-1, Balboa enters the match in the 64th minute to help strengthen up the defense, but it's probably a bit of a tactical sub as well after the Wynalda red card and the Caligiuri goal. And then Sullivan enters in the 77th minute for Bruce Murray, a name we heard before. It was part of that Clemson team that beat SDSU in the final. And this is a time where there's only 2 subs still for the World Cup. So right now we've had all 3 of SDSU's players make an appearance in this first match. Balboa coming in as first sub, Sullivan as the second sub. But 1 minute after Sullivan comes in, even though it looks like maybe the U.S., even being down a player, is kind of steadying the ship, they go down another goal, so it's 4-1. And then in the 90th minute, Czechoslovakia gets their 5th goal to make it 5-1. And it was a fair scoreline. I mean, I remember watching that game, and it was, if you get to, it's on YouTube or FIFA's website or somewhere, you can see this match. And it's, the U.S. is certainly outclassed by Czechoslovakia. They look a little bit like deer in the headlights in this first match coming in. But that was the first match. It is completely different in the second match. And the second match looks like it's going to be a disaster for them because they are going to face Italy, the host nation, one of the favorites to win the World Cup. And they're facing them in the second match. And everybody pundits, probably fans, everybody just expects this is going to be a disaster. If they get beat 5-1 by Czechoslovakia, what is it going to be like when they face Italy? Balboa gets the start in the Italy match. Wynalda is obviously suspended, so he doesn't participate in this match at all. The U.S. ends up going down 1-0 in the 11th minute, and just like everybody suspects, this is going to be a disaster. But the U.S. starts to hold their own and play pretty well. Now, one of the things I had forgotten until I went back and looked at this match in more detail is that Italy misses a PK also in this match where they could have gone up 2-0 pretty easily, and they hit it off the post. So the U.S. dodged a bullet there to kind of keep them in. And the 68th minute, U.S. earns a free kick. Bruce Murray takes it, forces Walter Zenga to make a diving save, gives up a rebound, which Peter Vermees, the longtime coach of Kansas City in MLS, he collects the rebound and shoots, and it was saved basically by the backside of Walter Zenga as it went under his body, but bounced up and kind of hit his backside, and he was able to stop it and collect the ball. And the U.S. was that close to leveling the match. In the 82nd minute, Chris Sullivan comes in again for Bruce Murray, and that's how it ends, 1-0. And all the reports and everything at the time was what a great showing the U.S. had against Italy. Not so much that Italy played poorly, but what a much better performance was for the U.S. in this one. And I think that's where, as a national team as well, earned a lot of respect in that particular match. They came close to scoring. They could have leveled it. Italy clearly missed some chances. Tony Meola had some good play and goal for that as well. But, they definitely did pretty well, which then brought us to the last match against Austria. The U.S. is not going to advance the group. I mean, they would need a win and a bunch of goals because of their 5-1 loss to Czechoslovakia. So this is still 24 teams. The third place team could make it through, but still highly unlikely. They'd need a win and a lot of help, a big win. The U.S. goes in with a much more defensive lineup. Balboa starts. Wynalda and Sullivan are both on the bench. Sullivan would not see the field in this particular match, but in contrast to the game against Czechoslovakia, Austria has a player sent off in the 33rd minute. So now the U.S., they have a chance. They could win their first match here. They're going to be playing up a player. But as they come back for the second half, Austria scores in the 49th minute. You get Wynalda comes in for Jimmy Banks, who's a defender. So certainly the U.S. is coming with a more attacking lineup. It's the last game. Why not? And then in the 63rd minute, Austria scores again. 83rd minute, the U.S. does score, gets their second goal of the tournament. The goals by Bruce Murray. Ends up being a final of 2-1. U.S. loses all 3 of their matches, but first World Cup in 40 years. Before we do our kind of post 1990 recap of where all these players ended up and where they kind of stand here in 2026, Dylan, do you have any thoughts or comments?
How was the? I mean, I know they still lost, but how was the performance against Austria perceived? I know you said they felt like they played a lot better against Italy. They didn't up a man for 2/3 of the game. You'd feel like maybe that was a missed opportunity.
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel it was a missed opportunity, but I think anybody who really watched the game, it didn't feel like Austria was down a man.
Yeah, that's fair.
At all. Yeah, it was. I think Austria. My recollection, and again, just going back through some of the highlights, recall that as much as a U.S. fan, you hoped and wished that something magical could happen. It was Austria, even a man down. My best recollections, they were firmly in control of that match. It really, I mean, it was 2-0 until late. But then, like we see in soccer, always a late goal, it's 2-1, something could happen. But it didn't. And I remember watching it and being like, just thrilled to death that they were there and they got to participate. But the highlight was certainly the Italy match, a match everybody thought they were just going to be destroyed. And I don't know, it's like the match we just had with Spain and Cape Verde. I think everybody thought Spain would just walk all over them. And, you end up with a 0-0 match and it's like a win. So even that 1-0 loss to Italy was like a win, the way they performed. And it certainly gave hope to me, as a fan, a very young fan, of the progress of U.S. men's soccer looking forward to the 1994 World Cup, knowing that they're going to be in it because they're hosts. But now the big thing is, you don't have to qualify, but how do you become competitive? And again, that's a whole other story. Could do on Bora Milutinovic and that whole process. All right, so let's do a little epilogue here. We've mentioned Bruce Murray's name a few different times here. And Bruce Murray, I would argue, even though we know names like Tab Ramos and John Harkes and Tony Miola that were part of that team, and then also were part of the 94 World Cup team. And I think that's partly why those three names especially are remembered a bit more, because they were part of that 94 one. But Bruce Murray, I think, really was the star of this U.S. Men's World Cup team. And in a friendly or something after the 90 World Cup, Bruce Murray set the U.S. men's national team record, all-time record for goals. It was like in September. I don't know. It was sometime later in 1990 after the World Cup. Do you have any guess what the goal was that he broke the record of? I know you might be able to see it in our notes, but
no, I mean, I haven't noticed that yet. I must have missed that when I was reviewing it.
So in 1990, Bruce Murray sets the all-time U.S. goal-scoring record when he scored his 10th U.S. men's national team goal, breaking the record that was co-held by two people, Peter Millar and Willie Roy, with 9 goals each. Those are some names that we mentioned briefly when we talked about the game we hosted in San Diego against Haiti in 1969 in San Diego. So that's kind of their time period of when they were with the U.S. men's national team. They both had 9 goals. Bruce Murray broke the record with 10, his 10th goal. He first one to make double digits for a U.S. men's national team in the history of the U.S. men's national team. But he would retire in 93. So he didn't play at all, wasn't available for the 94 World Cup. And he retired with 21 goals and 85 caps. They were both first all time for the U.S. men's national team. So I want to keep that in there because as we talk about our other players here. So Bruce Murray retires in 93, like I said, 21 goals, 85 caps. We'll get Marcelo Balboa first. Marcelo Balboa, obviously, we know has had tremendous playing career after this. He was U.S. Soccer Men's Player of the Year in '92. He earned his 86th cap in 1984, breaking Bruce Murray's all-time cap record in a 1-0 victory over Armenia. And that was a little before the 1994 World Cup. So Marcelo Balboa, first one to break Bruce Murray's record, also the first person to reach 100 caps for the U.S. men's national team, which he did in 1995. Back in 94, though, he played every minute of every match in that 94 World Cup. Probably one of the things he's also known for, which is one of his misses, was that bicycle kick attempt again in the match against Colombia that went just wide of the post. He's the first U.S. men's national team player to win the Men's Soccer Player of the Year award more than one time. He captained the U.S. men's national team to their semifinal appearance in the 1995 Copa America. In '98, along with Tab Ramos and Eric Wynalda, the first U.S. men's national team player to play in 3 World Cups. He played his final game for the U.S. men's national team in 2000 and wrapped up his career with 128 caps and 13 goals. His final goal actually was scored in 1997 2-2 friendly with Paraguay, their first opponent here in this 2026 World Cup. And that was played in San Diego. So Marcelo Balboa's final international goal was scored here in San Diego in that 2-2 friendly against Paraguay. He got honored with a star over at what was then the Home Depot Center, but I don't know, what do we call it now? StubHub? No, Dignity Health? Is that what we call the stadium?
Is that the one in Carson? Yeah, I don't
Carson.
even know what it's called these days.
Right. So anyway, they have a Hall of Fame kind of area. So he was honored with a star there in 2003. He was the second SDSU Aztec to be inducted into the National Soccer Hall of Fame back in 2005. And if we look now in 2026, where he sits all time, he's 6th on the all-time caps list and one of only 17 players in U.S. men's national team history to have 100 or more caps and, like we said, 13 goals. So that's kind of Marcelo Balboa and where he finished. Chris Sullivan, he doesn't quite have the national team caps and goals and stuff. He would only play 2 more times for the U.S. men's national team after the 1990 World Cup. He finished his career with 19 caps and 2 goals, but really what he is known for and ought to be known for is one of the first U.S. men's national team players to have a successful career in Europe. As we said, he started in France, but he also played in Denmark, in Germany, in Hungary. I believe that's where he met his wife, in Mexico, Sweden. He also played in the U.S. in the A-League, and he played for a year back in San Jose as he was wrapping up his career in Major League Soccer. And that was, with San Jose Clash in 1998. And the name might sound familiar. He has been a soccer broadcaster on Fox Soccer and BN Sports over the last couple of decades. I don't know where he is right now and what he's working on, but he has been involved in soccer broadcast, English language broadcast. Marcelo Balboa has done a lot of Spanish language broadcasts as well. And then Eric Wynalda, he was also part of the U.S. men's national team squad that made it to the finals in 1995 in the Copa America, semifinals of the Copa America. In 96, in January, he scored his 22nd goal in a 3-0 victory over Guatemala in a CONCACAF Gold Cup match, which broke Bruce Murray's old record of 21. So Eric Wynalda then became the U.S. men's national team all-time leading goal scorer. And when he retired, he was the all-time leading goal scorer until being passed by Landon Donovan. He also won several Player of the Year awards. He got his 100th cap during the 1998 World Cup group stage match against Germany. In 1999, he was named as U.S. Soccer Player of the Decade. He scored his final goal for the U.S. men's national team in a 3-0 victory over Haiti in a CONCACAF Gold Cup match. And he finished his U.S. men's national team career with 34 goals, which at the time was first, and 3 World Cup appearances in 90, 94, and 98. He also has been honored with a star at that U.S. Soccer Star Plaza over at the Dignity Health Center. In 2004, he was the first SDSU Aztec inducted into the National Soccer Hall of Fame, so a year before Marcelo Balboa. And in 2026, if we look back, he sits 13th on the all-times cap list. Still one of those 17 players to have 100 or more caps. He is, at the moment, as we record this, 4th all-time for goals at 34, but Pulisic is at 33 right now, and likely sometime during this World Cup to at least tie, if not pass, Eric Wynalda, but currently sits 4th behind Dempsey Donovan and Altidore. During the Senegal friendly, right before the Germany send-off match, so one of those pre-World Cup matches that we just had, Christian Pulisic just passed Eric Wynalda to take over 4th position on that new category of the goal contributions, right? Goals and assists. So Pulisic did just pass Wynalda for that. And Wynalda sits 8th on the all-time assist leaderboard for the U.S. men's national team with 16. As far as SDSU recognition goes, in 1995, Marcelo Balboa was inducted into the SDSU Aztec Hall of Fame, becoming the 3rd soccer player ever inducted into the Aztec Hall of Fame. The other 2 before that were Kevin Crowe and Vidal Fernandez. The next year, in 96, Wynalda was inducted into the SDSU Aztec Hall of Fame. And in 2017, as SDSU men's soccer was making preparations for their 50th anniversary of being a NCAA varsity soccer program, they were doing some historical looking back and remembrances, and they were naming these decade all-era teams, and all 3 players, Balboa, Sullivan, and Wynalda, were named to SDSU's all-era team for 1980 through 1989. And I think with that wraps up our segment here on our 3 SDSU players who had a significant part in the 1990 World Cup and beyond, and their contributions and legacy to the game. So Dylan, any thoughts and comments as we get ready to wrap things up?
Nothing really to add. It's pretty interesting to talk about the 1990 World Cup. I think for a lot of people in my generation, we kind of think of this new era of the United States soccer men's team, at least starting in the 94 World Cup.
Right.
And I guess you could make that argument in some ways, just in terms of the way that the sport kind of took off in the country after that. But yeah, I think this 1990 Cup kind of gets forgotten somewhat unfairly sometimes. So it's nice to kind of dive in on that.
Yeah, it's fun. It was, like I said, there's so much that happened in the 80s with our programs, right? But it's so different. After we qualified for that 90 World Cup, and we didn't have to for 94, but then we had all that time of qualifying for consecutive World Cups until we got to, Trinidad and Tobago in 2017. But, it was an expectation for so long that they would be there, but it wasn't the case. And just all the near misses and then just barely scraping by kind of things. Or you look at Mexico getting, banned for a couple years for playing overage players, which opened the door for teams to get into the Olympics and, kind of help build a little momentum there. I think like any bits of history, go back and all the what ifs. What if that didn't happen? What if we didn't even advance and that we lose to Canada 2-0 in that pre-Olympic qualifying tournament and we don't do the job when we come home and we're out of the Olympics before qualification really even gets going for the Olympics. We're just out again. But I think just interesting how much stuff changed and how much turnover, maybe. I'm not really sure what the right word is, but how many things were like we were trying as a federation, trying to really put a program and get things moving forward, and how many things just came together in the right way for us to make that 1990 World Cup in Italy, but also for a San Diegan and for someone, especially of my age, since all these players are very close to my age, and I was a student at San Diego State when Wynalda and Balboa were there and sitting in Aztec Bowl and watching them play matches against UCLA and Brad Friedel. Yeah, it was for me. There's certainly some strong memories, and of course, I think as someone's been there, you're kind of proud of the San Diego representation in that 1990 World Cup. All right, let's take a look at our trivia question, because we did ask just a second ago. Let me pull it up here again. Which 3 Aztecs were part of the 1994 World Cup, and how many can you name? So Dylan, we'll take it to you. We kind of given away 2 of the answers pretty easily here. So
Well, Wynalda was going to be my guess.
Yeah, so Wynalda definitely won. Balboa, I mean, we talked about how they made those 3 World Cup rosters, 90, 94, and 98. And I don't know if you're looking at it at all, but any guesses on the third person, who again was one of the people recognized before the Germany send-off match before this 2026 World Cup?
I mean,
he was there.
Yeah, I do have it in front of me here, but no, I it would have been just a toss-up between the other 2 that we discussed tonight. So yeah, won't give myself credit for that.
I get it pulled up here. So we said Balboa, Wynalda, and Christopher Clements, or what most people know him by, Clay Koyman, was the other SDSU player. And interesting because he was a bit older. Koyman actually played at the same time Kevin Crowe was around. So just before, actually, I don't know if Sullivan might have been there when they were still around, but as he came in as a freshman. But Koyman played around the same time as Kevin Crowe. And he has a very interesting story. We'll have to do a profile on him at one point, because his, I don't want to say biggest claim to fame, but certainly a significant thing for him is these first U.S.-born citizen to ever captain a Liga MX team. So there's a real interesting story in his pathway to that 1994 World Cup that we'll have to tell sometime. But those were the 3 players: Marcelo Balboa, Eric Wynalda, and Clay Koyman for 1994. And then once Balboa and Wynalda stopped playing for the teams, I'm not sure we've had an SDSU representative back up there again, but certainly we had a stretch there of some players from SDSU on the men's team. All right, with that out of the way, a couple closing comments. Dylan, I wanted to ask you, I forgot to ask you in the beginning, did you end up going to that final match between SD Inter and the San Diego Nomads, the final match of the UPSL season?
No, I ended up not being able to. I was pretty under the weather over the weekend, unfortunately, so.
Yeah, it looked like it ended up being a 4-4 match, which was not good enough for San Diego Inter to overtake the Nomads. So we did enter the playoffs last weekend, and the San Diego Nomads did advance. SD Inter lost, I believe, to City SD, so or City SC, sorry. So we are in the semifinals of the playoffs this weekend for the UPSL. So we'll get to that in a second. So for lower league matches, if you want to go attend them, now hopefully if you're listening to this right away as we record on a Tuesday, on Wednesday, the 17th, in USLW, the SoCal Dutch Lions, this is match day 8 for them. They're currently sitting in 4th place. They're going to be taking on Capo FC. And Capo FC is in 1st place, but that is going to be played Wednesday, June 17th at 7:30 p.m. at San Diego Academy High School. So if you want to go check them out, I believe that that's their final home match of the season for the USLW team. Their seasons, they're short and fast, like 2 months. And if you don't make playoffs, your seasons goes by pretty quickly. For the WPSL, it is week 7 for them. We have, as far as local teams go, the Rebel Soccer Club, which are currently in 1st. We'll be hosting Albion San Diego, which are currently sitting 3rd. in the conference. That match will be on Friday, June 19th at 7:45 p.m. at Monte Vista High School. And then, as we were talking about before, we do have a UPSL semifinals for the SoCal South spring season. And SoCal South semifinals, we'll see the number 1 ranked San Diego Nomads hosting City SC San Diego, which are currently in 4th place. That match is supposed to take place on the 20th on Saturday, but on the UPSL website, I even checked just before we were doing our podcast, the time on the location are still to be determined. I know the Nomads were playing their home games at Orange Glen High School, which is the closest high school to me. So I hope they are playing there. I might be able to sneak out and see that, but it also might be to be determined because they couldn't host there this weekend and maybe they're trying to find a new location. So I'm not really sure where that is. You'll need to check the UPSL website, but that match should take place on Saturday with the winners, from this semifinal and the other semifinal facing together. Unfortunately, this semifinal has both San Diego teams. The other semifinal has I don't know, an Orange County and a Temecula team, I think, in it. So I guess for me personally, if the Nomads win, then the Nomads should host that final match and it'll be easier match for me to attend. So hopefully be able to come out and catch that match before they get into the full national bracket for the UPSL spring season. And on USL2 for the men's side, City SC, remember they have teams in both USL2 and the UPSL. The City SC USL2 team won't have a home match again until the 5th of July. So they're in a string of away matches at the moment. And again, if you want to check out the full match schedule and any of the other games, go to the UPSL website or the USL2 website for our men's teams, or go to the WPSL website or the USLW website for our women's teams. All right. I think you're going to try to get out and see any of those this weekend, Dylan?
We'll see. I don't know. I'm kind of locked in on the World Cup, so I don't know. It'll depend.
Yeah, it is a difficult time depending on the date and time and other games that are going on. But I always find it enjoyable going out to watch some lower league soccer and watching some live soccer. That's fun. Okay. Just a reminder, This Week in San Diego Soccer History is brought to you by the San Diego Soccer History Society, a grassroots organization looking to uncover and preserve San Diego's rich soccer history and culture. And if you like what we're doing, please help us spread the word. You can like and subscribe here on our YouTube channel. You can engage in our community section here on our YouTube channel and follow us if you want on socials on Blue Sky at sdsoccerhistory.org. And if you're in San Diego and you like San Diego and soccer and history and all those things, join our volunteer team of researchers. You can reach out to me at john@bigpinedigital.com and we'll help get you connected so you can help us out and help us to tell some interesting stories about San Diego soccer history. All right, I hope everyone enjoyed this week's episode on SDSU's connection to the 1990 World Cup. We're going to be back next week, hopefully next week, but at least our next episode, where we're going to look at, and I actually have the wrong thing in my notes here, because since we had to bump some things around, we're going to look at a couple of San Diego players in particular that I don't want to give away because it ties directly into our trivia question. So let me pull that up. And the answer basically to this trivia question will be our... let me get it ready to go here and give a little background first. Will be the focus of the next episode. So in 2005, since we're kind of sticking with some national team stuff since we're in the middle of World Cup, the U.S. men's under-17 World Cup team, they won their group, but they were knocked out in the quarterfinals by Netherlands. Several future stars were part of that particular team. Josie Altidore is one of them, Neven Subotic, and Omar Gonzalez, to name a few. There was also, as we get this up for our actual question here. So in 2005 U.S. Men's Under-17 head coach John Hackworth called up these twins from San Diego for the 2005 U.S. Men's National Team Under-17 World Cup team. Can you name them? So the twins from San Diego that were part of that 2005 U.S. Men's Under-17 team with Josie Altidore, Neven Subotic, and Omar Gonzalez. All right, that's the trivia question for this week. And again, that will be the subject, kind of their history and how they made it to that Under-17 World Cup team and what they did after that. But the twins from San Diego that played together on that team. Dylan, have any idea who those might be?
No idea.
Yeah. This is digging a little bit deeper because they didn't have the same level of careers of the players we just talked about in this particular episode, but had professional careers in Major League Soccer and other places as well. So we'll talk about them a little bit on our next episode. All right, before we wrap up, Dylan, any final thoughts before we go?
Yeah, just on that background there, I often forget that Subotic was a U.S. international at the youth levels, and obviously hindsight's 2020, but that feels like it was a real missed opportunity there because he went on to have one hell of a career for Serbia and Dortmund and a couple other big clubs too.
Right, and that was one that we certainly, in a time period where we were worried about losing some players, that was one of the ones we lost, who we definitely wanted to keep. He certainly was a talent, and was in a World Cup for Serbia. So certainly, I think would have been an asset to us on our national teams at the time. All right, I think that wraps it up for us. So don't forget to send in your answers to this week's trivia question, and we will see you next time on This Week in San Diego Soccer History. Good night.